I'm very glad to welcome you all to our panel, Balancing Freedoms, How to Protect Freedom of Speech and Pluralism in Western Societies. We live in an age where values like freedom of speech, pluralism, and other cornerstones of democracies are increasingly under attack. This ranges from algorithmic manipulation over state-driven censorship to institutional intolerance. Because of that, last year at Munich Security Conference, Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, has raised the debate on freedom of speech and pluralism in Europe. By that, he elevated the topic from a purely normative matter to a debate on national and international security. On that matter, I'm very deeply honored to welcome Her Excellency Undersecretary of State, Ms. Sarah Rogers. Thank you for being here.
And thank you so much for having me. And freedom of speech begins with turning on your microphone. Is this on? There we go. All right. So I have been advised that I should lead us off, which I'm happy to do. So I joined the Trump administration this year after a career as an attorney with focuses including the American First Amendment. And I'm very pleased to speak on behalf of America in 2026, which is our 250th year of existence. So America framed its First Amendment, which says, among other things, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, in 1787, after winning our Revolutionary War, because we were tired of being told what to think and say by the Brits. And that is a topic that surfaced in J.D. Vance's speech as well, and has surfaced in my diplomacy. But freedom of speech in America since our founding has followed a really long and interesting course, and it has developed not just as a matter of law, but there are cultural and technological developments that have impacted to the practical reality of whether each American can think and say and see and read what he wants, which I think is really what that freedom is about. So, at the beginning, after 1776, after 1787, freedom of speech in America didn't go anywhere for a long time because it was only a federal constitutional amendment. And most of the kinds of laws that would threaten freedom of speech were being enacted at the state level. So very early on, we had things like these sedition acts right after the war, where one president didn't want people supporting his opponent. And that didn't even get challenged under our First Amendment because the First Amendment was this narrow federal thing. But our First Amendment really developed into its current jurisprudential form starting in the early modern era, around the era of World War I. Now, what I said in my Senate testimony when I was confirmed is that freedom of speech protects the least popular, the most inconvenient speech. And that isn't a weakness. That's the whole point. And what you discover if you look back at the history of American freedom of speech, it's that the kind of speech most people agree with, or most people agree should be allowed, that speech never comprises the test case because nobody tries to ban it. So what kinds of speech that went up to our Supreme Court are responsible for the freedoms we enjoy today? Well, in the early 1900s, it was anarchists and communists who were trying to dodge the draft, as well as people who were spreading scurrilous, sometimes anti-Semitic rumors in newspapers. And Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, our first Jewish Supreme Court justice, basically came together and developed this idea of a marketplace of ideas. And what they said is like, look, what the First Amendment means is that different ideas have to be able to vie with each other in an open market to win over minds in a democracy. Because really, that's what democracy is. Democracy is a compact that if you disagree with the government or with your neighbor, you can bring your viewpoint, any viewpoint, to the public square. And you can try to persuade the government, try to persuade your neighbor, try to campaign on your view, try to win on it, instead of picking up a torch or a gun. That is the essence of peaceful democratic self-governance. And so we should let the ideas contest with each other and let the boldest win. And that shaped our freedom of speech doctrine really in the World War I and the interwar era. And after that, freedom of speech went on to protect the speech of communists during the Red Scare, and it went on to protect the speech of artists during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, including very unpopular and provocative art. A lot of our free speech test cases have involved hate speech, and a lot of them have involved pornography. And our Supreme Court has generally come down with the view that the government cannot proscribe any viewpoint. The government can't tell you what to think or not to think. The government can sometimes tell you what the time, place, and manner of your speech needs to be. No neon billboards in a residential area after dark. But even if your speech is pretty abhorrent, the government can't punish you just because of what you think or what public policy you want. So that's the legal development of freedom of speech in the United States, but freedom of speech has developed in other arenas too. So there are cultural and there are technological factors that impact it. The United States is the birthplace of the internet, and by extension, social media. And a lot of the dynamics that we take for granted on social media wouldn't exist if not for odd quirks in American law. So we have this thing called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that says if you're an internet platform, you can't be punished the way that a publisher would for the content of what you host. So if it's a copyright violation, it's defamatory, you can't sue Mark Zuckerberg for what's on Facebook, basically. That's a quirk in our law that preceded the rise of social media. Like, nobody knew that Facebook would exist when we wrote that law, but if we hadn't written that law, Facebook wouldn't exist. Another doctrine we have in American law is called fair use under copyright, and what that means is if I write a book and you want to sell copies of it, you've got to pay me something. That's my intellectual property, but if you just want to read my book and learn from it, that's free. And the reason that's important is because it turns out that if you want your AI model to read my book and learn from it, that's also free. And that's why ChatGPT and all of these other AI products exist, is because of this quirk in American law. Free speech, both the legal and the practical reality of it, have been shaped by the structure of media over the centuries. So the era of fascism, communism, mass ideology was also the era of mass media. This was a time when over the radio and later over the television, one speaker, like me on this stage, could address an undifferentiated mass of workers or of soldiers and seed ideas in that audience, and the audience would react as a mass. But that changed in the 2000s because the internet became mobile, social, and local. And for the first time, that audience could coagulate into little clusters and react back at my speech. And that's changed things a lot. It has, every time the structure of communication shifts, institutions faced challenges. So we had 200 years after the invention of the printing press to develop the institutions of modernity, and those were rocky years. The invention of the telegraph and the invention of the film strip changed how we communicate and how we govern ourselves. The invention of the television changed what kind of candidates win elections and how. The invention of the internet, and particularly social media, and particularly transnational social media, are changing that too, as is AI. And so we're going through this really rocky, tumultuous period where society is responding to a seismic shift in the structure of communication, and we're deciding how we want to deal with that. And at each of these moments of technological change, each time the speech landscape shifts, there is an understandable kind of panicked impulse to censor, to constrain, to fetter the innovation, kind of put it back in the bottle, to contain some of the legitimate chaos and instability and institutional challenges that result. But if we look back at history, if we look back at all these other moments, the printing press, the film strip, if we look back at those challenging Supreme Court cases from the 1910s where we were asking ourselves, should communist draft dodgers be allowed to speak? Should Nazis be allowed to speak in the United States, not Germany? Should this artist who wants to insult Jesus Christ, should he be allowed to speak? I think from the American perspective, we look back and we're grateful for the people who stood on the side of principle and said yes. And now we're at another moment where we're facing analogous such challenges. Now, even if you're allowed to speak by the Constitution and you're enabled to speak by the internet, your neighbors are going to react to what you say. And so another dimension of the free speech debate involves so-called cancel culture and wokeness. This has been a big prominent topic in American political discourse for the last decade, I would say, especially. So one of my legal clients in my private practice was Charlie Kirk. And he kind of stood for this principle of, even if you have a provocative viewpoint, you should debate it. And the American Free Speech Compact is that you can debate any viewpoint without getting shot. And Charlie got shot. And so standing for free speech means standing against that. Now, after Charlie got shot, I saw a lot of Americans wearing a t-shirt that I hadn't seen for about 10 years. I owned that t-shirt too. And that t-shirt said, "Je suis Charlie." I am Charlie. And we bought that t-shirt in 2016 when Charlie Hebdo was attacked for its free speech. And I tell this story when I address European audiences, because my European interlocutors often say to me, look, you know, our free speech tradition is a bit different than yours. Our history is a bit different than yours. And that's undoubtedly true. But as Western societies, as the free world that stood against communism, we have certain things, certain commitments in common. And Americans stood up for this free speech rights of Charlie Hebdo. Most of them had never read that magazine, didn't know what it was. But they stood up for the free speech of Charlie Hebdo because they thought that was right. And it was American history and tradition that taught them that that was right. And I think a lot of Europeans shared that impulse. So I think we're facing complicated questions today about speech, about technology, about how they intersect. But I come from the American courtroom where the way that you find a truth is you make sure that every side, every bundle of interests has a forceful advocate for it. And I see it as my role to be an advocate for that maximalist spirit of free speech that helped give us the internet, that helped give us the current form of the American Constitution, that maximalist form of free speech that protects Charlie Kirk and Charlie Hebdo both. And with that, I'm happy to start the discussion.
Thank you so much for your speech, Madam Undersecretary. Next, I will introduce the other panelists who will engage in debate with you, starting with Mr. Kuban. You are a member of the German Bundestag for the Christian Democratic Union, which is also leading Germany's government at the moment. Also, in the parliamentary group of the CDU, you are the chairman of the working group on European affairs, meaning you are very much confronted with European perspectives on that matter. Also, you are a member of the Bundestag Committee on Economics and Energy, and also on the Committee on European Affairs. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being here also to you, Wixa Fürsten. You are the head of the podcast Berlin Playbook by Politico. They're also a very renowned journalist from Politico in the German media landscape. Thank you. Next, Mr. Winkelmann, you are the president of the Young Transatlantic Initiative, which was founded in 2011. You are president of the Young Transatlantic Initiative since 2024, and you're a very renowned and well-known voice in the transatlantic community in Germany. You have studied at the University of Maryland and are currently studying at the John F. Kennedy Institute in Berlin. Thank you so much for being here. Last but not least, thank you, Mr. Rashidi, for being here. You are a very renowned voice and journalist from North Macedonia, but you have also worked for the BBC, have worked together with several other media outlets like Deutsche Welle. Thank you for being here and sharing your perspective.
Thank you very much.
So starting with Mr. Kuban, as you are a sitting member of the German Bundestag, the majority of Germans, so do statistics show, seems to be afraid to openly express their opinions. How much freedom of speech does actually exist in Germany, and what is your personal experience with that, and also in contact with the citizens you're speaking with?
Yeah, Esma, thanks you for hosting this panel and inviting me over here. It's absolutely it's very interesting to see that all of you are here to discuss with us this interesting topic. You've mentioned, Sarah, the birthplace of the internet. I would, in the beginning, mention the birthplace of the freedom of speech, which is the democracy in Athens. So we, as Europeans, are very proud to have the birthplace on our continent and to have also the birthplace for the freedom of speech over there. But you also have mentioned the past, where we've seen, especially in Germany, the fascism and the socialism over here, where freedom of speech was not guaranteed anymore. So, and we are very proud as Germans, especially the Germans from the eastern part, that the people went to into the streets to fight for their freedom of speech, to get that back, especially in the eastern part, and that we now have the freedom of speech over here. In the end, freedom of speech is guaranteed in Germany, but there are also some limits for the freedom of speech, which is because of our history, especially also thank you to the Americans in the past that revitalization is of the Holocaust is something which is forbidden in Germany. So we are very proud of that. We have mentioned, or we have this in our law, that it is unacceptable if there are people in Germany, if there are politicians in Germany, they say that the past, the fascism was only a fly dropping, that this is absolutely unacceptable for us. So there are a few limits for the freedom of speech because of our history, and we are very thankful to the Americans that they advised us after the Second World War to implement that in our constituency and in our constitution and in our law. So I would raise the topic to say, okay, we are very, very happy to have the freedom of speech. We are very proud of the freedom of speech, but the freedom of speech which is guaranteed also does not mean that there could not be somebody who is disagreeing with you. So that is for sure, you are able for agree to disagree, and we are very proud of that as well. So in the end, somehow, some way, there is not only one truth. There are different opinions, there are different meanings, and there are different arguments, and to discuss them, this is what we like to raise as a democracy, and that is why I see in Germany you can tell your opinion, you can tell your story, but you have to be aware that there's always somebody who has a different opinion, and this is what I feel very, very good, that we are discussing the things, and in the end we are discussing it in person, but we are also discussing it in the internet, because also the internet is not a lawless space. So we have to make sure that this is that also over there it is guaranteed that there are some limits for the freedom of speech, as I've mentioned from our history. You also mentioned the topic of violence, because also from my perspective, violence is always unacceptable. It's unacceptable against Charlie Kirk. It is unacceptable against any other politician, and it is unacceptable if you do it in a room or if you do it in the internet.
Well, speaking of the internet and cancel culture, that's especially matter for young people. Mr. Winkelmann, what's the perspective of younger generation on that topic?
So first of all, thank you to our panelists that you're here. I think it's an honor for our organization that we have this very high-ranking panel here, and we are very glad that you're all here. And I also want to thank all of the young people, especially, who are here. I think this is a very young audience compared to most of the other events at the Munich Security Conference. And I think maybe you should, I don't know, we should appreciate that, because it's not really something that you see all the time, that young people are so interested in politics. So coming back to the issue of free speech and cancel culture, I think that especially for young people who, have to go to school, of course, have to go to university, have to go to all of these places, the atmosphere there is not very supportive of free speech. Let me just be blunt here. Oftentimes, students are afraid that they might get bad grades by teachers who might have certain opinions and are not accepting of other opinions. Maybe they're also afraid to being ostracized by their peers if they are voicing their opinions. And I think it changed in the last couple of years, and it has become more difficult. considering what happened even like on the governmental level, there was one case in Germany where, for example, a person, he was paid a visit by the police because he called the German economy minister a fool. I think there's like a tendency in the last couple of years that free speech is not as liberally seen as it used to be. And I think we should face that. Of course, we have a different history, we have a different set of laws when it comes to certain things, as you already said. And there are reasons for that, of course. But I also think that there's a lot of pressure to conform to certain viewpoints. And I think it is important that we talk about this. Not all of it is due to laws and, the police cracking down on people or whatever. Some of it is just pressure from the broader society, I guess, or from the media. But even then, we need to address that because, as I think Olli already said it, there are polls like 60-70% of people in Germany are afraid to speak up their mind, and this shouldn't be the case in a democracy.
Ms. Fürsen, Rixa, we've heard quite different views on the state of freedom of speech and how it is being valued in Germany. You, as a quite analytical journalist, what is your observation on that matter?
First of all, I am very grateful to be born with the privilege of living in a country which is a democracy and which has free speech. And I also observe among peers in general in the public, also among young people, that free speech is kind of limited. And I think the internet has a lot to do with it. And I think it's super interesting what you said, your remarks, because how we can express ourselves changed so vastly in the past 20 years that we cannot really adapt to it. And I think our values of freedom of speech have to kind of change to it, because nowadays anybody could say anything under any given name, and then it could be multiplied by many and loads. And I think that is a very powerful tool that people are afraid of. And this is what we have, not only in the internet, but what we take to work in the classrooms, to our neighbors, that it is just very powerful, and people became very intolerant of different opinions. And when you made your remarks about Western democracies, I had to think about a quote of a German socialist activist, actually. Her name is Rosa Luxemburg. She died, I think, 150 years ago, and she said, freedom of speech is always the freedom of the ones who think differently. And I think that's a very correct quote. You probably said it very similarly, although I assume you have very different political views. And I would say that it's a shame that everybody is so afraid of saying what they think. I mean, cancel culture is also a way of expression, freedom of speech. I can disagree with you, and it's my freedom to do so. And what puzzles me is when we look at especially what young voters choose these days in Germany, they pick parties from the radical left or the radical right because they think they embody what is most liberal or freedom of speech. And I completely disagree with that, because I think we have not a perfect democracy, but I don't believe there is a perfect democracy, but we have something very valuable worth fighting for, and then choosing parties who are actually at least partly illiberal, thinking that's a liberal choice to make. I don't understand why parties like your party, for example, doesn't really have the ground to kind of get to the people as much as people from the AfD or the left in Germany on TikTok and other different internet platforms.
Ms. Rogers. We have heard 3 different perspectives so far. Ms. Rogers, Madam Undersecretary, do you share the analysis of one of our panelists?
I've heard interesting perspectives from each. I think it's absolutely right to credit the Athenian origins of a form of free speech that got picked up in the European Enlightenment. The Athenian concept of free speech was called parrhesia in Greek, and what that stood for was fearless speech. So the Athenian conception of free speech was that you had it if you weren't afraid to speak truth to power. And the question is, what does it mean to speak truth to power, and what forms of that should be allowed? We see vignettes in Germany where people get their homes raided by police for calling a politician fat or calling a politician a vulgar name on Twitter. I don't know how vulgar the word pimmel is, but apparently that was at the center of one of them. And I'm sorry if that was too vulgar for me to say on stage, but I'm an American, so I just don't know. And you know, now the rejoinder could be, look, you're allowed to call the politician a tyrant or say he has bad policies, you're just not allowed to call him fat. But that's a way of speaking truth to power. Like in China, there was this huge censorship crackdown because people were depicting Xi as Winnie the Pooh. And that was rude and that was insulting. But I think most people in Western democracies intuitively thought you should be allowed to call the president Winnie the Pooh. And maybe you should be allowed to call him fat. Maybe like, that's the greatest, humor is the greatest form of egalitarianism, that none of us is above ridicule, that somebody might call you fat. If the emperor doesn't have clothes, the crowd is allowed to say it. And so I think the panelists who raised that raised an important point. I think with respect to cancel culture being another type of free speech, that's obviously true. Like, I have the First Amendment right in the United States to go on Twitter and say, I really dislike this Facebook comment that my enemy made 7 years ago, and I think she should be fired from her job, and I think she should not be allowed to be hired at any other job, and I'm going to rally my mob on Twitter to say the same thing and ruin her life. That is a form of behavior that happened, especially in the 2010s, and it's difficult to deal with because it complies with the First Amendment, but in practice, it really chills freedom of speech. But I think there's something interesting that some of the comments also touched upon, which is that new technologies enable people to speak in new, scary ways. So there's a story that a lot of people in the tech sector tell, and I apologize if you've heard it before, but I think it's relevant. When the film strip was first invented, people had never seen moving pictures before. And the earliest film strips showed a train, a freight train, coming at the screen. And when they showed it in the theater, people were terrified. They jumped under the seats because they thought the train was going to hit them. And similarly, when the printing press was first developed and people could print their own Bibles, the Catholic Church freaked out because suddenly the clerisy doesn't control who can have access to the Bible. Anyone can read it. And you could have your own Bible if you wanted. And what was that going to do? That was going to vulgarize and fragment religion. It was going to cause heresy. And I think what has to happen in each of these instances is we have to get accustomed to the technology and develop antibodies for it. So in the case of cancel culture, I would say between 2012 and 2020 was the real peak of these mobs getting people fired. But what eventually happens is society learns to adjust. And that still happens, but not as much. So there was a Walmart cashier who said something vulgar about President Trump after his assassination attempt. And there were people on Twitter trying to get her fired, but a lot of people were saying, wait, she said something terrible, but we don't want to live in the kind of society where a Twitter mob can get you fired. And I think that responsive voice didn't exist at first, and it exists now. Similarly, one of the worst, earliest cases of cancel culture involved an American woman named Justine Sacco. She got on an airplane in 2013, and she tweeted that she was flying to South Africa, and she wrote, "Going to South Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white." Now, she was making a joke about how if you're privileged in Africa, you're less likely to get AIDS, but people on Twitter decided this was racist. And so before she landed, they ginned up a campaign to get her fired from her job. She got fired from her job. Then a media outlet called Gawker, one of our most influential early blogs, tracked her down at her new job 2 months later and got her fired again. They just posted, now she works at this company, we should get her fired again. That was a disgraceful case, but people didn't understand how disgraceful it was because the power of internet hive speech was new. But what happened years later in the New York Times was the New York Times tracked this woman down. The first journalist who got her fired apologized for it. They kind of talked about where she was in her life, and the culture kind of agreed that what happened there was wrong. And so I think part of it is, you know, humans are a social species, and we are really attuned to our social status because early in human evolution, your social status rank determined whether you got to eat scarce meat, whether you got to reproduce. It's as vital to us as water or air, knowing what other people think of us. And so, but we're accustomed to caring what people think of us in our small family and tribal groups. Now you can suddenly know what millions of strangers think of you, and it really scrambles the human brain. It does something to you, but I think people are starting to adjust to that. And so it might just be like adjusting to seeing a freight train coming at the screen, adjusting to seeing an AI show you a picture that looks real, but now you see AI stop and you kind of know what it is. I think some of this is just adjusting to being the kind of species where you can go on the internet and not just know what your friends and family and townsfolk think, but know what all those people think too. And I would just encourage governments to let that happen and keep a lighter touch on regulation, rather than trying to prohibit it, because I think when you try to prohibit it, you know, prohibiting saying something that could get someone fired is a big mistake. Like, I might want to whistleblow against my employer. It might be important for me to say that thing. And it might be important for me to call the politician fat, because maybe he's pompous, maybe he eats too much, and, you know, maybe that's a sentiment that resonates with the people. So, those are kind of, but I think everyone offers valuable perspectives, and those are my responses.
Mr. Rashidi, Ms. Rogers has just illustrated cancel culture and the results of cancel culture. You have a huge experience in media and have worked together with many media outlets. What's the role in media in shaping cancel culture?
Thank you for your question, but first of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel and to discuss something which I find really important. Also because of the history of the country that I come from. I'm based in Skopje right now in North Macedonia, but before, as you mentioned, I've worked in London, in UK, and all the Western Balkan countries. But why I'm mentioning this again? You mentioned, all of you, about aspects of democracy, Athenian, and then First Amendment. And sometimes I do lecture, and I always show the First Amendment when I do lecture to students and young people about how important is this American Constitution and how much it influenced the world, and of course our democracy and where we come from. But when we speak about history, you just made me change a little bit what I wanted to say, because in our country, in our part of the world, we probably shifted all the shades of freedom of speech in very short amount of the time. And I will explain that. And what I want to say also, it's good that we discuss about it. In the beginning, in the early 90s, for us and a lot of people in Western Balkans, freedom of speech meant a right for some ethnic group to say what they think about their life. It was really crucial about life and death. And we didn't have this opportunity because the media was controlled by a particular state, and at the time there were only state media. Later on, we learned a lot about democracy, and we copied the transatlantic way of thinking what the freedom of speech means. And that meant we should criticize our government, and that's what we did. And we learned it, and we were all over. I mean, like myself, I was an IVLP student, and Deutsche Welle, and BBC, and everything. And we learned this, you know. But then the government didn't like us. So we had this switch when the government started to control our media. So now the freedom of speech started to be something else. Then we turned to internet. We said, okay, you can control the media, but we have the internet, you know. So it was great because we can still criticize, and of course we had some regime fall and all that stuff. Now we have a different debate about freedom of speech, because now we think maybe we should something control it to the internet, because what we see there, it's not quite right. In what sense? Nobody can control the internet. Let me be clear about that. But maybe we have to educate the public, because not everything what is said is journalism, not everything what is said is right. The technology, which is changed a lot about the freedom of speech, also created a diversion of how people perceive now freedom of speech. So why I like this debate here is because we can talk about it. And I will just make another symbolism. You know, I'm based in Augsburg, which is not so far away from here. And Martin Luther, the priest, was there, and he tried to change the church, and he was so opposed about it. But then the change happened, and it influenced all the Western world. And my thinking was, is opposing the question, is the cancel culture the question, or debating about it? I think we should be more open about the fact that we should talk freely, that the freedom of speech also, it shifts. It doesn't mean the exact thing, and that's not bad. It's part of transatlantic way of thinking, but not necessarily always mean the same thing for all of us. But I should underline that doesn't mean that we should cancel someone saying it, but of course we should be careful not saying something that would offend or let alone bring violence to someone else. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Mr. Rashid, you have brought the Balkan region into debate, and some on the panel have also mentioned the cultural difference between the United States and Europe. So my question to you, Riksa, is as an analytical journalist, what do you perceive are the cultural differences in free speech between the United States and Europe, and what lessons can we in Europe draw from the United States?
Well, Ms. Rogers, you talked about how you were sick of the Brits dominating everything in the US. I think the US dominated a lot in Germany after 45, and that was a very good turn you took, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think we adapted a lot of what's coming from America. We can see it from all pub trends, pop culture trends, political trends and everything. So I think we are very much alike. Maybe you are a little less fearless or more fearless than we are. You mentioned, Mr. Kuban, that we have some more restraints in free speech, saying we want to stick to a healthy and glued together society, which comes with constraints because everything has consequences. I can insult you if I wanted to, but obviously then there would be like a very bad relationship afterwards. So I'm just thinking about not doing it maybe if I don't have to do it, and you could go to court. So I think there are many similarities. I think that the US, as much as I can consider it, has even like more glued to the DNA, the freedom of speech. And in Germany, I have the feeling, also thinking about like the literature is coming from Germany like ages ago, that freedom of speech is also freedom of mind and not always speech. I don't know if you can follow along that difference.
Yeah, I think there's a great quote from one of our Supreme Court cases. This involved Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a small religious group in the United States. They don't like to salute symbols, and they didn't want to salute the American flag. And it used to be required to salute the American flag in school in the 1940s. And Justice Jackson, who's one of our great Supreme Court justices, he was the one who dissented against interning the Japanese during the war. What he said was, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it's that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox. In religion, in conscience, in philosophy, the government can't tell you what to think. The government can't tell you what viewpoints are allowed in the public square or you're allowed to entertain. And so I think you're absolutely right. And one reason free speech is important is that it is freedom of thought, because if you ban a concept from being spoken or written about, then eventually people aren't going to think about it as much. I think the World War II history is obviously relevant, and when I tour Europe as an American, I'm very proud because I stand in buildings that we liberated and helped rebuild, and I see, a Germany that is rebuilt where people are really committed to liberal democracy, and I think America's role in that is one of our greatest contributions to the West. I think that if Europe were only banning Holocaust denial, we wouldn't be having these fights on the internet. Because Holocaust denial is a very small amount of speech. Not a lot of people are trying to deny the Holocaust, but an
increasing number, actually.
Well,
what are we banning? What are we banning?
Well, okay, so for example, after the Cologne rapes, you had a politician who called those rapists barbarian gang raping hordes, and she faced legal sanctions, and then more laws were put on American social media companies for allowing her to say that. But actually, in America, we just went through a movement called Me Too, where we said it was really important for women to be able to speak about rape. So that's the kind of speech that the American Constitution would protect. And it's forceful, vehement, rude speech, but it was in response to a very horrific act. And that wasn't Holocaust denial. That has nothing to do with the Holocaust. When President Trump ran for president in 2016, there was an illustration in the New York Times depicting him in a Hitler outfit, calling him a fascist. And that was legal, and it should have been legal, but I say this because when you say that you're banning fascism, the definition of that can get distended. So people call their enemies fascists. They called our president a fascist.
But Holocaust denial is not banning fascism. It's not the same.
Okay.
It is
I
not
think if you wanted, you can paint Friedrich Merz in a, like with a Hitler beard or whatever.
Right.
That wouldn't be very elegant.
No, I'm not
but
saying
you
I'm not saying you're banning that. But what I'm saying is that when you say you're only banning Nazism, only banning fascism, like sometimes what you're banning.
denying the Holocaust.
Yes, yes, yes. But my point is that.
Saying that it's only a fly dropping, as Mr. Gauland from the AfD said.
Right. But I also have seen examples of banned speech in Germany where an EU official actually brought me these examples to defend the internet censorship. And one of them was a couple of kids posing at one of the concentration camps, and he put a caption on there like, you know, going to the concentration camp with my friends. And you can't actually tell what he's saying. He could be, it's not denying the Holocaust. It's being flippant about it. And maybe that's offensive, but it's not denial. And there's a famous comedian who used to go around singing these anti-Semitic songs and filming how people reacted. And that was a Jewish comedian. And his point was, when I tell these jokes about the Holocaust and I film the audience, I'm making a statement about anti-Semitism being acceptable. That kind of comedy should be allowed. But if you're removing things from the internet because they make jokes that could be perceived as anti-Semitic, and we know that that's happening because EU officials have shown that to me, that is true, then you're suffocating more conversation than just Holocaust denial.
But it's, sorry, but it is, don't want to have a dialogue, but in the end it is also, I know it's a small balance between, on the one side, if the panel goes to the one or the other side, freedom of speech and also freedom of art. You also know this after the Super Bowl. This is, it's always a bit of it is a small amount where you see on the one side, is it art, is it freedom of press, is it freedom of art, or is it freedom of speech, right? So this is something which you always have to balancing, but therefore we have a justice system, we have a court, we have the possibility to go there, and I would insist something because it was said, and it was said very often over here, that there are some politicians who were blamed or who were insulted, who has been threatening violence. And actually also, even if it's not me, I would also say this to other politicians, rather they come from different parties. Also, there is not a way of lawlessness against politicians. Also, politicians, if it could go to court if they feel I don't want to do that like Habeck did, because I think this is pretty much more freedom of speech. But if somebody is threatening violence against me, I could go to court. And actually, we've seen what happened to Charlie Kirk, even he was not really a politician. But it is the start of a beginning of that. In the end, that it becomes violence.
But
so we have to talk about that as well. If you see people who, if it is okay for the society that we are always there and you can do everything you want with a politician, I don't think that there will be good politicians anymore. Because from my perspective, you can criticize politicians. You can also be very tough. You can be very rough against politicians, but there's always a limit for that as well, because we are in the end, we are also persons, we are fathers, we have families, and so on and so forth. So we have to talk about that as well when we talk about freedom of speech.
So before democracy and monarchies, there was an offense called lèse-majesté, where if you offended the dignity of the king, you could be arrested. And I would say that having the police raid someone's house for calling a politician fat looks less like preventing violence and more like lèse-majesté. This politician's better than you. You're not allowed to call him fat. Charlie Kirk didn't die because someone called him fat. Would you say sometimes it's the truth?
Sometimes it's the truth.
Oh, yeah. The truth, yeah. No,
but the thing with the... Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is everyone intuits that there's kind of an area where speech shades into violence, and different countries draw that line in different places. So in America, we have a doctrine called incitement, imminent incitement to lawless action. So I can call anybody fat, and I can even call people worse things than that. I could say, I could call someone a Nazi, or I could call a communist, or worse. But if I'm giving a vehement rally speech to a crowd, and I point into the crowd and I say that, I won't say something really vulgar here because there's a lot of kids around. But if I say, go get him, like there he is, kill him, right? that is a point where I am imminently inciting a crime. Or if I just say, let's go burn that car. That's kind of where America draws the line. We think about time and place and space. It just if I post a copy on the internet of the Unabomber manifesto, even though that manifesto talks about committing violence, or a copy of Mein Kampf even, posting that on the internet is not imminently telling someone to go do violence. In the case of Charlie Kirk, the shooter was in this chat room channel with these radical transgender activists who were literally saying, like, let's go to kill Charlie Kirk. If that speech had been known about by the authorities, they would have been arrested. Like, that was against American law. What you're seeing actual violations of the law that just the police didn't catch, which is tragic, but it's not an indictment of the First Amendment. Anti-Semitic speech is one of the biggest problems, I think, that compel people to call this issue complicated. But what we find is that the per capita incidence of anti-Semitic hate crimes, even though we allow all kinds of anti-Semitic speech in the United States, is actually lower in the United States than it is in Europe. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But if it were cut and dry and simple, if banning the speech banned the violence, then you would see less violence here.
Well, maybe just to add to the discussion, I think we talked a lot about anti-Semitism, and I think we should all agree, and I think we agree, that anti-Semitism is a bad thing, and I think nobody really argues about it, right? But we should also not pretend as if the issue of freedom of speech was only about anti-Semitic people who claim that they are violated in their freedom of speech. I mean, oftentimes it's about other people and other instances. I already mentioned Habeck with, you know, because he thought that he was insulted, and that's why he, you know, made the police go to that specific person's place, who actually, this person died, by the way, just a couple of weeks ago, so not because of it, I hope.
Not because
but in any case, I think we should be honest about it, and there are so many instances. You already mentioned
but please stay right? So it is, you're insisting that Mr. Habeck sent the police to his home. This is not true. It was not a decision. So even I'm not from the Green Party, I don't have to be the lawyer of Mr. Habeck here. But please let us stay. But please let us stay with the truth. He don't decided that the police should go to his home. That's not true.
No, he didn't. But the thing is, Angela Merkel, for example, she was obviously insulted over her 16 years as a chancellor. I guess so, at least. Never did she go to the police and said, well, this person, whoever it was, insulted me. And yes, of course, it's not because he ordered them to do it, but, you know, it's like there is a certain difference when it comes to how politicians handle insults than it used to be a couple of years ago. And I think, especially during the COVID era, it seems like a lot of politicians changed. And now they think that they, you know, need to be sort of like very, very protective of themselves in a manner that is, in my view, limiting freedom of speech in this country. And just to add to the other thing, we talked about this transgender thing. People were fined because they were misgendering someone in Germany, thousands of euros. And I think, is that really necessary? Is that really
okay? I give you an example. I was punished, I was blamed, I was insulted a lot of times in person, in the internet, and it doesn't matter. And then once, maybe you can tell me if you would take the same decision. Then once, there was a picture of mine with a headshot in the mailbox of my dad's home. Would you go to a police station and say, okay, this is enough is enough, or would you say this is something which you have to accept as a politician?
Well, of course, there's such cases, and we talked about incitement.
It was not my mailbox; it was the mailbox of my dad's home.
Sure, but still, you know, this is.
Would you do so or not?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would do it. Maybe I would, but this is not the point. You know, I'm not a politician, thank God. So I don't have to make that decision. But you know, the thing is, most of those cases are not about those things. You know, it's not like that there are people sending around letters with pictures of politicians with a bullseye on them or whatever. I think most of those cases are in the internet, and most of them are about like rudeness possibly, and you know, people being, I don't know, not very kind to politicians, and maybe also, you know, but the thing is, it's different than just to pretend that all of it is just, you know, oh, it's incitement, it's Holocaust denial, and that's only the issue that we are speaking about. I think there's a much larger issue, and I mean, just, you know, if you ask a couple of people here, I would assume that a lot of them had situations in the past where they were afraid to speak up because there's like an atmosphere.
Let's ask the audience.
Yeah.
We'll do that. We'll do that in the end.
I think we're entering in the area who speaks who and how powerful is the word of someone who says something. Because now we are living in the age, as my colleague said, that everyone conveys a message. Before, at my time when I began to be a journalist, not everybody had the possibility to speak in public. Right now we have thousands of people that they can just put the camera and say something. And then we enter in the area who says what. And I think that the blurred side about freedom of speech begin because if a politician says something, of course it's more dramatic, and then we should be more careful because then the other people can copy. But if someone somewhere there, I don't know, just posts something which is not it doesn't have so much influence, it would be as much impactful as we think it should, or it would, you know. So I think that we should start and discuss the antibodies that we should take, as you mentioned, about how we perceive the messages conveyed today, especially through internet. And I think that we are not prepared with this. Probably, I mean, again, being a journalist for me is a responsibility to speak in public. And I will tell an example, and it came from some diplomats. I was in an event, and I was in an elevator, and I was going down, and then this diplomat says to me, "Oh, I have the corruption case about this diplomat. Would you publish it?" And I said, "Okay, can you give me some documents?" And then they said, "No, but if I give you, everybody will know that I will give it to you." And I said, "But how can I say this?" And then, you know, this is a journalism for me. I cannot go and say something, but what it struck me with this case is that even the diplomats and politicians are ready to hear any sort of things in a public domain, even though it's not verified. And this is the scary part about maybe what we are talking. Because if a politician says something, people would assume that it's verified, that is something that he knows, that probably he read it, rather than just an opinion. How do we do it? I don't have a solution, but I think we should debate it and talk about it, because if we just leave it there, you know, is it freedom of speech? Is not. I think it's not. I think it's not enough. I don't know.
I think those comments are very smart, and I think, you know, we're already seeing little green shoots of innovation in this area. So when Elon Musk bought Twitter, a lot of people thought that was catastrophic. He's going to allow all kinds of racism, and he does allow a lot more offensive speech. But there's also now a product called Community Notes. And the way Community Notes works is if you see a tweet and you see misinformation, if you're a trusted user of that platform, can write a little editorial note. And then different users vote on which of the notes are helpful. And in order for a note to get promoted and attached to the tweet saying this tweet is false, here's something else you should read, different users with different viewpoints have to all agree that it's true. And so what that algorithm does is it prevents, you know, a bunch of Republicans or Democrats or communists from all swarming the same tweet and voting for the same thing. People who usually disagree have to agree. And that product is helpful. I often see tweets that have false information in them, and there's a note at the bottom explaining what's false and why.
Once you see the false information and then you see the footnote, by the way, this is false, you already have like the belief of the false
I actually don't think that's true. I think in a way, some of the most powerful tweets that have gone around have been ones where a public figure says something false and then the community note corrects it. So for example, I'll give you a real example about anti-Semitism. There was a BBC Gaza correspondent who was a vicious anti-Semite. And after the Bondi Beach attack, he tweeted that it was a false flag by the Jews. The Jews faked this attack. And there was a community note at the bottom. The Twitter users, who, you know, people want to constrain their freedom of speech, had to correct him. And this went all around Twitter. And it was this really stark showing of how, you know, ordinary people thought this anti-Semitism was vile, and this guy should never have had his job.
But I would disagree with that one, because I think that's a very strong case that you're making, and when you have like very obvious false information, then it's easier to depict. to that. So if you or if I would be given a different name on this panel, probably not many people would notice that, apart from my family and friends.
Right.
But but it would be false information. It wouldn't be super harmful, but still people would believe it and not saying, by the way, her name is not Marie whatever, it's Rixa Fusen. People would still think that I'm the other woman with
Well,
the other name.
you raise an interesting example because for the community notes model to work, it has to be a falsehood that people care about. And not everyone has to be able to perceive it. A small number of users can see that it's false. And if people care about it, then it gets elevated. Another interesting thing that the community notes does is if I like or I upvote a tweet that turns out to be false, and it later gets a community note, Twitter will actually send me a notification. It messages me. It says, a tweet that you interacted with has a community note that you should go see. And I'm not saying that this is a panacea, but I think it is an example of a way to fight back on false information without just censoring it. And the reason I don't want to just censor it is because when we tried that, a lot of true information got censored. Because people sometimes don't know what's true. Sometimes there's a debate about what's true. So did the COVID virus leak from a lab? You know, our CIA thought probably yes. But our government was telling Twitter, take those tweets down, they're false. Did the COVID vaccine completely prevent transmission? The truth is it helped prevent transmission, but it didn't completely prevent transmission. Doctors who were saying that got censored because people thought it was false. So I think that the best way to deal with false information is to give people the truth. And I understand that that's never perfect, but the risk of censoring something just for being controversial is really bad. And another peripheral risk to that is then people stop trusting the healthcare establishments at all because they thought it had lied to them. And having an open, transparent debate can feel messier, but it leads to less of this oppositional, paranoid distrust in institutions, I think. So as a voice for the US government, one thing I try to do is be transparent and tell people what I'm thinking and why, and I'm not always right, but that's better than censoring the views that I think are wrong, because I might not be right at the end of the day.
I'm not just, like, I also think that these community notes are a good tool to kind of fight it and allow it at the same time. Yet it's not perfect, but social media and the internet, I mean, social media is like huge, huge topic and probably could sit here for hours and days even. And I think there are many problems with social media that I can also not solve. So on the one hand, it's like the truly most democratic space there is because it gives power to everybody. It enables everybody to be the same or have the same opportunities and be equals. And at the same time, it endangers what we consider a liberal democracy because people are ruthless. There's not a code of conduct when you said, as a journalist, obviously, my press freedom is also connected to I know what to say, what to write, what to publish, and what not to do, because I won't be punished if I'm not doing that, but I wouldn't be considered a professional. And I think that this is lacking in the internet. This is lacking with the people. People don't have to show their faces and give their real names, which is also a big problem. And then we have all these echo chambers that show me people I'm agreeing with, and then the louder I am, the more popular I am. So people are just becoming more and more ruthless, and these are dilemmas that we face, like multiple dilemmas that we face at the same time. And I have trust in the society, but I don't have enough trust to think that we can figure that out ourselves.
But
I would
if I just add, I'm sorry.
I would like
it's
to add
about also the who says it on the internet, because now we have these influencers which are not perceived by probably us here as professionals in terms of what journalism means. For us, it's a system. You have to verify, you have to talk with the people, you have to find facts and then publish it. And then, you know, there are these people who can say whatever they want. But if a politician would go and say and mark something like false or true, and a lot of people would believe it, then we have a problem, or some scientist or whoever. And then how do we discuss about this? And this is really important for any society in the modern world, especially Western society, because we are so linked with the freedom of speech and liberal democracies and how we think our future. So that's why we have to discuss it. And maybe that's the way of somebody just said it's true or false, but for me also is a big question, who verifies it, you know? So we have to make these questions.
So
Sorry.
just let me add one thing, because it was raised by you in the beginning, in your opening remarks. And also the social media does pushing the easy answer, right? So it's always easier to, in 10 seconds, to give the easy answer than it is. But we all know over here that mostly the world is more complex and more complicated. So that is, in the end, it is not only the easy answer which is right, but the social media algorithm is pushing it. So that is what I would add. And only one question, because we are also learning over here. Sarah, maybe you can give us your 2 seconds on that. How you see the influence by other states, like the Russian bots, the North Koreans in the social media. Also, Trump is trying to take TikTok under control because it's an instrument by China to influence the society. How do you see that in this context?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think that there are a lot of features of social media that probably affect how we communicate and think in ways that we're beginning to understand. And social media is evolving so quickly that those effects are evolving quickly too. So some algorithms will show you things that other people like you liked a lot. And sometimes that's a video of a cute puppy, sometimes it's a horrible crime story, sometimes it's an easy answer, sometimes it's an attractive girl. And the algorithm gets to know you better and better and better, and it'll pull you in. And there are a lot of really interesting conversations going on about this, and a lot of interesting conversations about, is this addictive? Is it something we should let children access? Some platforms are now developing a kids version of their product. So OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, we've noticed that if you interact with these LLM, these large language models, they'll be very sycophantic and they'll do your thinking for you. So if you're trying to get your kid to do his homework, that's a problem because he doesn't learn to think on his own. So now they have a product, a study mode for teens that the parent can set the kid's account to, which instead of doing your homework for you, will ask you questions and kind of act like a tutor. And I think that's an example of a good development. And maybe we make a different. There are people in America who've discovered that if you set your phone screen to black and white instead of color, you'll feel less addicted to social media. And Apple now has a feature on the phone where you can limit your screen time or limit your time on certain apps. I think none of these are instant solutions, but they show people kind of groping toward like if we think about what do people really want? I might want to be slim and healthy, and I might want a cheeseburger. I want both of those things. And the capitalist market and the apps on my phone are trying to serve me what I want. And the answer to that might be sometime, you don't ban the cheeseburger, but you tell people what's in it, and you give them other options, and then eventually, hopefully, you invent Ozempic, and then people can regulate their own appetites better. So maybe the Ozempic of phones is something like an app that limits your time on like extremely dopamine spiking content. Maybe I think people are trying to invent things like that. On the foreign bots and inauthentic behavior, I think that's another really big question. And this is just like false information, the foreign propaganda operations. It is a real problem, and we have seen the censorship solution to it fail. So we saw Charlie Kirk, who was not a Russian bot. I knew him, I promise you. Like, he was a real American. All of his opinions were American. He was on one of these NGOs, had like a top 20, Russian disinformation spreaders list he was on because he voiced opinions that Russia agreed with. And that's not why he was voicing those opinions. And so I think the best way to deal with this, the way my office is dealing with this, is we try to expose the foreign information. So we had this big anti-Semitic influencer in the United States, and it turned out that most of his traffic came from Pakistan. So all the people retweeting him, they were like in these distant countries, maybe paid call centers, and that information got publicized, and it changed the way people saw the content. I think what X is doing now, where you can see the provenance, see where each person is located, is a great way to deal with this. It's, again, nothing is a complete solution, but this is an incremental partial solution. I just made a report to Congress on how we're combating foreign interference, and I just named some groups that were getting foreign money. And this gives people more information to make their own decisions, which is, I think we should err in the direction of doing that. And it's going to be a bit of an arms race because AI is going to get more sophisticated at being fake. But then there's also AIs that can tell you if something is real. So the New York Times has, there are these apps you can subscribe to now where you feed a picture into it and it'll tell you if it's real. And I plan through my office to support the development of that kind of technology as well. So those are some ideas.
And actually, in the end, it could also bring democracies under pressure when we talk about election campaigns. I was in Moldova and Romania last week, or this week. And over there, what we see in Russian interference is massive. So actually, I have a different opinion to J.D. Vance, who raised the topic last year over at this conference, because when you see, and your intelligence might know that as well, how many Russian bots sent one message from in a massive kind of way to push one candidate in the end of an election campaign. This is interference, foreign interference, this is Russian interference, and that is why, from our perspective, we have to be aware as democracies, because that's the difference, right? We have a free, we have the freedom also to do elections, to vote. But if there is a foreign interference, that is not a free voting anymore.
Well, I think one issue is that, I mean, you already said we have elections, right? We have free and fair elections. People can decide what party they're going to vote for, right? So, I hope so. But this also means that even if we are fed with wrong information, even if there are bots in the internet, even if there are lies on the internet, it doesn't really matter, because we gave the people the choice to vote what they want to vote for. And it's not a qualified vote where we're just telling them, oh, you can only vote if you get the right information that we decided is the correct information. I don't think that's how democracy works, because there were always lies in campaigns. You know, that's just the truth of politics, I guess. I mean, you know about it. So I would say we need to be more open-minded. We should trust our people, because that's what we do in a democracy.
Maybe you can give the Balkan perspective.
I not only, but I will try. I'm involved in a recent time with the research of finding, and there are here a lot of young people, which is great, and maybe they can confirm it, political realities of Gen Z in the Western Balkans, in all the Western Balkans. The report will come up on the 1st of March in Brussels. We will make it big, because it's important to see what they think and what the Europe thinks and all that stuff. But one thing that I can share here is that the way the young people getting information, and I think when we talk about these issues, we really should have this in mind, because when we talk about democracy and freedom of speech or everything what we want, if the information that we have doesn't reach them, that's pointless. So I think, since you are here a politician, I think that education is one aspect. And of course, when you say this, it's a little bit boring, because, you know, education, schools, and all the things. But when we speak about antibodies and how to educate people and what is deepfake and everything, I think it should start with this notion that not necessarily the generations have the same meaning about freedom of speech or democracy, or how the political message is transformed. So I really think that we should think about it and do something about it. Of course, I don't have the solution. I wish I had, but I think that we should have this in mind. And I hope that the young people here can confirm it, because if the main channel of information for young people is Instagram, and we come on a traditional media and speak about the thing, these messages will not get across, and that's a problem, and we really should think about it.
Actually, I can give you one thing, because I asked the same question to the security advisor of Maia Sandu, the president of Moldova, and he said, "Follow the money." That was his advice. Have a look where the money is going. Have a look where the investments are, how these interference comes.
I agree with you, because I deal with that, and it's easy to find maybe who is interfering the electoral process. But even if we don't have, I speak about the normal political dialogue, like you as a politician, when you want to attract young people to vote for you. If you do not have the understanding how do they perceive the political messages, or maybe you will go to television or write an article, but they want the message to be sent via different means, then we have a problem. We should understand the young people how to perceive the basic element of political debate, not only who wants to interfere. In that part, I agree with you. Just follow.
Absolutely, but in the end, you need the same level playing field, right? So if if you see in an election campaign there is arguing, there are maybe also lies, and there are others who tell you they want to have it this way or they want to have it that way, it's absolutely okay. It's a competition, and it's absolutely okay. But there need to be a clear level playing field. And if you see
Absolutely.
what happened last year in Romania with the presidential election, there was no level playing field anymore. There was a foreign interference, and this is something which is unacceptable. It's unacceptable for democracy.
I totally
Mr.
agree with that.
Mr. Rashidi, you have mentioned antibodies and education. So my question to the panelists is how to protect freedom of speech and pluralism. We will start with you, then gather, go around and end it with you, Ms. Rogers, and your lessons from America to us Europeans. Please, because we are running tight on our time, keep it short, like 1 to 2 minutes.
It's a very tough question. First of all, because I mentioned the study that we do, I think that first thing we really should start and educate the young people. Why? Because one of the colleagues here, who was the reason that you invited me, he put me a question yesterday or something like that. He said, everything is going so bad. Do you had one point in your life that maybe something was right? And you know, it made me think they don't know that actually it was worse in my part of generation, and I really have seen some things to go better, and now probably we are declining. But my point is, we should understand and we should talk to young people the values of Western civilization, of freedom of speech, and how important it is. Even though there are challenges, we have to mention to them that there are challenges, but that's the best that we have so far. So I think a short answer to your question is that. I can go on and on, but I think it's enough.
Awesome.
Well, I think there are different levels. So from organizations like yours, I think you should continue this, talking about the freedom of speech, because we can talk about where its implications lie and what we can do and say, which is a great measure of expressing the freedom of speech. From the politicians looking at the social media, I expect to protect freedom of speech, to not ban undesired comments or anything, but I also expect to protect the truth and not allow people from Russia just throwing in bots and bots and bots. We don't have to protect the freedom of speech of people that are not even there, who are just, I don't know, trolls and bots. And from you and each of us, I expect to chill a little bit more, just to agree on disagreeing. How wonderful is that, to just say, I disagree with your opinion, but I'm happy that you're having it. And also to speak up if someone is not only like saying the Holocaust didn't exist. Obviously there are different comments where you can just like, dude, this is way too extreme what you're saying, or I think you're having wrong ground of what you think truth is. But I think it's wonderful to discuss, and I like to talk to people that have different opinions than I am, or given in one kind of agreed playing field, obviously.
I totally support your 3 points, and I would like to raise the last one as the main thing, because it is on us as a society to stay together and to keep the society together, even if there are different opinions. So actually what I see is that, especially after COVID, we saw that a lot of people are only around with their mobile, and they see in the algorithm only that that they have one meaning, and everybody around you is having the same meaning. But to feel and to see that there could be also others in the room who have a different opinion, but you can argue, you can discuss, you can drink a beer together and have a good evening. This is what keeps a society together. And therefore it is on all of us. On the one side, we have to do some things as politicians, for sure, but on the other side, it is for all of us to keep the society together, not divide us, because this is, from my perspective, the main point to to that topic?
Well, I think that first of all, everyone has an agenda. You know, legacy media has an agenda. Politicians have an agenda. People on the internet have an agenda, and of course, you know, there might be foreign influence as well that, you know, tries to influence the outcome of elections in our country and others. But in the end, you know, this is what it is about. It's a marketplace of ideas. You know, this is what freedom of speech really means. We should all trust each other that we can discuss issues, we can have different opinions, and we shouldn't police speech. We shouldn't tell people what to think or what to say. And I think that's where we need to head. And of course, we talked about it, there might be some boundaries, but I think we should aim for more free speech and not less.
So I think, picking up on the first set of comments, that we absolutely should teach kids to value free speech, but I think we should also teach them about the internet. You know, teach them, and there was this curriculum that they did at one of our local schools in America where they picked, you know, they gave each kid like a little iPad to chat on, and they had one girl chatting with someone who said he was in another classroom, I'm a boy your same age. They talked about what pets they had, what sports they liked. And then a large, and I think I'm allowed to say this in Germany, fat man walked into the room who was like 50, and he looked gross and weird. And it turned out he was the one chatting on the other end. And that is such a valuable literacy lesson for kids. And, you know, you need to teach, people need to understand that the AI is programmed to please you. They need to understand that the opinions you see on your social graph are the most provocative ones, not necessarily the ones that represent how everyone on the other side thinks. And this is pretty easy. I mean, well, I won't say that it's easy, but I'd say, you know, putting together a literacy curriculum for people is not the most expensive, challenging thing in the world. I came here I don't know how many days, because I've been traveling a lot across time zones, but maybe 5 days ago, I was in Dublin at an OECD conference where the United States pledged $500,000 this year to develop child safety mechanisms that preserve free speech and develop other things like, other approaches like this that preserve digital freedom by advancing some of these legitimate social interests in ways that don't censor the internet. I think that's part of it. I think when it comes to, I also want to tell two stories of a foreign election interference in the United States, or attempts at it. So in 2020, a laptop was dropped off at a repair shop that had allegedly belonged to Hunter Biden. And there were a bunch of things on it that were very unflattering to the Bidens, suggested corruption in Ukraine and so forth. And the New York Post published the contents of this laptop. And some intelligence community authorities said, we think the Russians planted this. And they didn't think that the information on the laptop was fake, but they thought that Russia wanted people to see it and that they had hacked this information and created this laptop, basically, was the theory. So what happened? The leadership of Twitter, this was before Elon Musk bought it, forbade anyone from posting the link they censored the New York Post, one of our oldest newspapers. If you texted that link to your friend, your text message got deleted. No one was allowed to talk about it. What did this do? This made everyone want to see it, and on the internet, if you really want to see something, you can find it. It created a bunch of conspiracy theories. It magnified the issue beyond what it would have been otherwise, and it really embarrassed these prominent Americans who had censored this news story, because we're against censorship in America, and a news story that impacts a presidential election is the exact kind of thing that you shouldn't want to censor. That's the exact kind of thing the First Amendment exists for. Even though, you know, I think people were justifiably concerned that a foreign power wants you to see this information right before the election, the correct outcome under freedom of speech is you should be allowed to see it. Now, 2024, a different foreign government, Iran, hacks into a server and steals an opposition dossier on J.D. Vance with unflattering, allegedly, information. I don't really think it was unflattering, but it had his social security number, it had all kinds of information about J.D. Vance. And they leaked it onto the internet. And instead of banning anyone from discussing that document, what the government did and the New York Times did and other sources was they said, we think Iran wants you to see this. And it really didn't become a big story. Most people who know about the Hunter Biden laptop don't know about the J.D. Vance dossier. Even though, you know, there were very similar cases of hack and leak, allegedly, operations by foreign governments with malign intentions. So I think if there were foreign bots swarming Romania's social algorithm, social graph in advance of the election, if each of them had a little label on it that said, you know, we think this is a foreign bot, that would be pretty helpful. And it's better than censoring Charlie Kirk because you think he's a foreign bot and he's not. And it's better for democracy, not just because it allows more freedom of speech, but because it fosters more trust in democratic institutions, because people don't think that there's a shadowy arm of the government determining what they're allowed to think and say. I'm really pleased to have been on stage with multiple alumni of IVLP. That is International Visitors Leadership Program, is a program my office oversees. And we pick prominent, you know, young leaders and rising politicians and officials and professionals in various fields and students, and we bring them over to the United States. And I'm looking forward to doing several programs on freedom of speech and technology this year. And I encourage, you know, young people in the audience to continue interacting with our amerikahaus, American Spaces, to apply if you see one that suits you. We really enjoy these exchanges, and I've appreciated being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your perspectives on freedom of speech and how to protect it. In the spirit of freedom of speech, we will be taking questions from the audience now. Toby from our organization staff will go around with a mic. Please keep it short and civil. Thank you.
I will start on the back maybe and then go forward. Maybe you raise your hand that high.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that panel. I was wondering, do you think there's an additional responsibility not only to allow all speech, but to maintain a level of decorum in speech in political life?
Could you maybe show your face and name your name?
He's just sitting.
Just,
Yes. My name's Lucas. I'm a student at the LSE.
So I'll speak to that. I think, you know, by the government, there's probably not a responsibility. I think the government should allow the maximum range of not threatening or violent speech, but rude speech, because if you try to put a thumb on the scale, then what's going to happen is the government censors the rude speech of the people it doesn't like, allows the rude speech of the people it does like, and you want everyone on a level playing field. And I really do think that a big part of democracy is we're all the same. You can call anybody fat, you know. But that said, you know, private companies and employers and places like that often choose to maintain a level of decorum. I think at a university, for example, you know, to preserve maximum freedom of speech at a university, you might allow someone to protest a speaker. You might allow them to hold up a sign saying you're a fascist. But the minute you start screaming and yelling and throwing things, you should be removed from the room. And that's how you preserve an atmosphere of open debate at a university, because you can't heckle and prevent others from hearing. I think at the office, you know, you might actually fire someone who goes around calling everyone fat, because that disrupts the workplace. And so what I would say is you want maximum freedom of speech in the society as a matter of law, but when people form voluntary associations, you know, they should be able to kind of determine what level of decorum is best for that setting. And then on social media, you should have the ability to choose who you interact with and what kind of content you interact with. You might want to interact with South Park clips, which are very rude, but you also might want to interact with a circle of friends who are nice to each other, and people should be given maximum choice and autonomy to have the kind of experience they want.
Okay, there's one more hand on the left. What is your name and what is your question?
Hi, my name's Eleanor. This is for the Undersecretary. I have noticed, I've lived here for 20 years, but from one American to another, I've noticed a lot of lecturing from home towards Europe about free speech. And I think of 3 examples at home, and I'd like your perspective on them. So when Ann Seltzer got fined by then President-elect Trump for a poll he didn't like, was that her free speech being violated? When CBS was sued for $15 million for not editing or not releasing an unedited version of Harris's interview, was that a violation of freedom of speech? Carolyn Levitt just told whoever the anchor is at CBS, if they didn't release the unedited version, they'd sue their ass off. And then to Herr Kuban's point, in the biography of Mitt Romney by McKay Coppins, he explains that Mitt Romney was one of the few people after January 6th that voted to impeach Trump because he had enough money to hire private security. A lot of Congress people get very serious death threats that influences their voting. And to me, that is a definite chill on speech. So I'd like your perspective on those examples.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think when I interact with Europe, I try very hard not to lecture. I think, we're not lecturing, I think we're warning, because we've had experiences, especially with things like cancel culture, and we don't want our friends to repeat our mistakes. And, our relationship with Europe has, we have this great shared history together. I mean, America and its European allies beat Hitler together and then beat communism together. And we were, throughout the Cold War, we called ourselves the free world. We have a NATO mutual defense pact. And we have laws that are enforced on the same internet. So it actually matters to us. Having these debates matters to us. And I don't agree that having these debates amounts to lecturing or scolding, nor is it lecturing or scolding for European politicians to express views, as they often do, by the way, about American politics and American political events. Now, to take your examples one by one, Ann Seltzer did not pay a fine, so that's false. Yeah, but you have the right to file a lawsuit in the United States now because we have a First Amendment, unlike in other countries. If you file a lawsuit that affronts the First Amendment, that lawsuit can fail in court, and we actually have a measure called anti-SLAPP, where if you file a frivolous defamation lawsuit, the court can punish you for that. Are you sure Iowa doesn't have an anti-SLAPP? Well, then I was free to adopt an anti-SLAPP, but the point is, I don't think that anyone filing a lawsuit is a violation of free speech. I think some lawsuits, probably shouldn't be allowed to succeed as a matter of free speech. And actually, in 2010, we enacted this statute called the Speech Act. And what that says is, because we had this problem with defamation libel tourism, because those kinds of libel lawsuits are so much less likely to succeed in America than anywhere else, people would actually go abroad. Like celebrity Scientologists who got angry would go to England and sue each other. There's this retort people would use, I'm gonna sue you in England because I can't sue you here. And so Congress actually passed a law saying, foreign countries that allow defamation lawsuits, I think in Germany, some of these arrests for insulting people are in the nature of defamation. It's kind of a similar thing. We actually have a law that says a foreign defamation lawsuit that violates the First Amendment, that judgment is not enforceable here. So I completely agree with you that defamation lawsuits, if abused, can be chilling, but I don't think that is a violation of free speech to sue. I think that the court has the responsibility to apply the First Amendment, and I've been involved in litigation like this, so I have experience urging courts to do just that. I would also say that America has never contended that, we are a saintly society with no censorious temptations. We went through, during World War II, like every country, even Western democracies, we were worried about domestic subversion and herding people into camps. That was wrong. We went through the Red Scare. We went through wokeness. That was very bad. And in each of those instances, it's not that our society never falls victim to that. It's that we're glad that we have a First Amendment to help protect us. And that's why on our 250th anniversary, I praise those laws.
Okay, we will be taking one last question. We are running out of time, so please keep it very short.
I would hand over the mic to you. What is your name?
My name is Nicolo. I'm from Switzerland. I have a question about the disinformation in social media. In Switzerland and also in Europe, I'm not familiar with the system in the US, but we have public broadcasts. And what do you think if we would invest more in public broadcasts, especially in social media? Because I think the normal media isn't very good at social media. They can't make that much money. So what do you think of that?
I think in Germany we are already in, I work for a private media house, so obviously I have maybe a bit different opinion. I think in Germany we invest a lot of money in the public broadcasting, and I'm a huge fan of the public broadcasting. I think it's super important that we have, people laughing, I think it's super important that we have good journalism that is not run by numbers, but that have the capabilities also to make reports from Uruguay whenever it is needed, which is very expensive for a private company. But still, I wouldn't say that they have naturally better journalism than the companies that actually earn the money that they're making in the media business.
A different experience in the Balkans. The public medias are not so strong, so we're advocating to have them more, because the private sector is usually bought by politicians, and they also invest in a bad journalism. So it's a different perspective.
Like, you worked for the BBC,
yes,
which is public broadcasting, and they are very different from what we have. Like, we have 2 public broadcasters in Germany, and then the public broadcasters, they invest also in entertainment as well, not only news as the BBC does, news and
entertainment.
Documentaries.
But I was just giving perspective from the Balkans, so you know it's a different perspective probably for each country, but the education is the base, whether it should start from little for freedom of speech, but also how to take care in the internet.
Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to the panelists, Tilman Kuban, Lukas Winkelmann, Nazim Rashidi. Thank you so much, Rixa Fürsen, for the short-term response on participating. And it has been especially a great honor seeing you at our panel, welcoming you here, Madam Undersecretary Sarah Rogers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also to the amerikahaus for hosting us, helping us in technical matters, in organizational matters. Thank you to the Munich Security Conference, in which this Emerging Leaders series is being made possible. Thank you so much for the help from the staff of the Young Transatlantic Initiative, and of course to the audience.